Well, hello. This time around, I would like to introduce the topic of Caribbean literature. I'll be referring to Caribbean history in general too, but mainly our focus is Caribbean literature. First, what we understand by the term Caribbean or the Caribbean. These are the islands and coastal countries of the Central American region. According to this definition, Costa Rica would also be a Caribbean country since we have a coast on the Caribbean Sea. However, for the purposes of this course, and mainly we'll talk about the islands and the island countries of the Caribbean. These are other names by which the Caribbean is known: the Antilles by the French, particularly, that's what they call them, and the West Indies by the English. This referred to the Caribbean Commonwealth countries. These were the countries that were formerly colonies of the British Empire, West Indies. Of course, these countries are the result of the colonial projects of Spain, Britain, France, and Holland. And even today, they remain, they're still seen and perceived in terms of the colonial powers that governed them during the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. These were originally plantation economies. Sugarcane was the major product that they provided the Western world with. Also an important, a key factor and a key element of the society and history of the Caribbean is the slave labor that came from Africa via Europe. You know, the European colonies bought slaves, sorry, the European powers bought slaves from Africa and brought them to America, forming this triangle between Europe, Africa, and America. And what's in between, what is inside the triangle is known as the Middle Passage. It is very strongly related to the experience and the terrible experiences of these slaves that were brought from Africa had, where they were crossing the Atlantic to get to America, to get to the Caribbean. And there, much of the literature is also, and much of the historical records are based on the experiences of these slaves crossing the Atlantic. The Middle Passage is a strong concept in the mentality and idiosyncrasy of the Caribbean countries and their heritage, right, and their history. There's a lot of cultural and ethnic diversity, as you may imagine, in these islands, and that's why they're called the hybrid par excellence, right? These are the hybrid countries because of all the movement and all the cultural contact that took place in the area. A very interesting fact, and it's very important to keep in mind, is that when Christopher Columbus first arrived in the Americas, he arrived to these islands, and there were natives there, there were indigenous populations there that do not remain today. They were completely destroyed. So by the time the English, the French, the Dutch colonized the islands, there were pretty much no indigenous inhabitants. So even today, they don't have what we have, right? They are not original peoples and original languages in the land. So mainly the African slaves that were brought in huge numbers to the area became the natives of the land. They replaced the indigenous inhabitants that were there. 6 million indigenous inhabitants, at least, that did not survive, right? And there are no descendants of them. It's also very interesting. One fact that is very interesting is the diglossic nature of these cultures. When we say diglossic, we mean two languages or two forms of communication, because since they brought the original African languages, but were colonized so strongly by the European powers. So what we have today in most of these Caribbean countries is that this diglossic social structures in which there are formal institutions like higher education, government, etc., that speak the European language of the colonizer, whether it is French, Spanish, English or Dutch. And then there are other um, informal institutions, like everyday life and even literature, um, music, art, that employs the Creole languages or the patois, which are a mixture of the African languages that they brought and the European languages that they entered in contact with. Now, these Creoles are not what many used to consider as bad English, but they're languages in their own right? And they stand for native languages, since, as I said before, there's no remaining original inhabitants and descendants of those inhabitants, so there are no original languages. The original languages, quote unquote, of the Caribbean islands are these Creole and Patois languages, right, that are a hybrid of African languages and European languages, and they're very particular and very rich, and we have them in Costa Rica too. We have the Patois in Costa Rica too, and they're not being considered dialects of English or bad forms of English or French or whatever other language is used in the island, but languages in their own right, and they're acquiring more and more power and visibility. Now, going back to the historical aspects of the Caribbean and the Caribbean islands, there was a tiny white European elite that controlled large numbers of Black slaves using military force and violence, but they were ultimately outnumbered. And many of these slaves escaped their masters, and they were called the Maroons. The Maroons are the runaway slaves. And they formed their own communities. And from these communities, the revolt and the resistance started, and ultimately leading to independence. First in Haiti, it was the first Caribbean colony to gain independence in 1804, and also the emancipation of slavery and of slaves in the 1830s in the islands. After independence and after the emancipation of slavery comes the Indenture System, which is a system in which the white masters and the plantation owners, since they didn't have slaves anymore, they ended up hiring, quote unquote, workers from India under terrible, inhumane conditions. So they were little more than slaves, right? They were hired, but they were not treated in a very humane way. They were called the coolies, right? Those were the workers from India. And of course, as you can imagine, there's more mixture, more diversity in the culture, in the languages, in the religious practices. There's even a larger combination of traditions and cultures that started to build up what we have now in most of these Caribbean countries. One exception, however, is Jamaica, that remained mainly Black. Hence, that very strong Black nationalist movements like negritude, the concept of negritude that I think already mentioned earlier. That's the idea of the pride of being Black and the going back to Africa feeling, in the African identity, that's the one that defines them, et cetera, et cetera. All this originates mainly in Jamaica during this period, and also Rastafarianism. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's very much related to religion and to music, like reggae music. It's all about Black origins and African identities, and it's very strong coming from Jamaica and then spreading all over the world, particularly where the Africans ended up as a result of the diaspora, right, caused by slave trade. Now, in terms of literature, one concept that is really interesting is the Daffodil Gap. The daffodil is a flower that's mainly a European flower, but many poems in the Caribbean countries, or many traditions in the Caribbean countries, would refer to the daffodil, even though there were no daffodils in the Caribbean. This is a it's a symbol, it's a metaphor, or a very paradoxical situation in which the Caribbeans were seeing their world in terms derived from a different world. So they didn't have the language, and they didn't have the um, the perspective that was needed, especially linguistically, to talk about their own identities in their own terms, because the language that they're using is the language of the colonizer, or their Creole language that is not an original language from the land. So they would like to refer to their own realities, and they didn't have the words to do so. So they would use foreign words and foreign um, concepts and foreign ideas. That's what's called the Daffodil Gap. This predicament of not finding your own identity in terms of your own reality and trying to construct it based on the foreign ideas. Another movement that we find, or another concept that we find in Caribbean literature, is this opposition between the escape to England, because many authors actually write from that position of going back to England. I'm talking here particularly about English-speaking Caribbean countries that were colonized by the British. So going to England and owning back the resources that the colonial power, that the former colonial power has to offer, versus remaining in the country and exploring the local visions and the reconnections with their ancestral heritage. And so there's always this ambiguity and this contrast in the literature. We'll also find a quest for belonging and overcoming these alienating structures, like in the case of the Daffodil Gap or the European influence. And in poetry, very important is the African tradition is very much present, and it's the poetry of the Caribbean, most of it written and produced orally and even written in forms of patois and Creole languages. They reflect a lot the African traditions. It's very performative. It wasn't meant to be written and just be left there in a book, but it was intended to be performed, accompanied by music, dancing. So it's a different type of poetry, and it's very much related to the African tradition. And finally, a few concepts that are really characterize the literature and the history and tradition of the Caribbean countries is transculturation, displacement, right? The diaspora, the ongoing diaspora, of course, and also the transfer and translation, not only in terms of from one language to the other, but also from one ideology to the other, from one system of beliefs to the other. And not just African and European, but also Asian, with all the Indians that came in. So there's a lot of diversity and a lot of movement and a lot of cultural contact going on. Okay, so hopefully this will give you a general but clear view of a Caribbean culture and Caribbean history and literature. But remember to bring questions and comments to class. And I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.